I am continuing through An Orestia, translated by Anne Carson, and I now come to the third and final play in this collection, Orestes by Euripides. Now, as I've recently been working my way through some classic Greek drama, I make the same disclaimer in every review, which is, this isn't really so much a review as me just talking through what I've read, because I'm not intelligent enough to give this a review, and, in order to really give this a review, you'd have to study this and read all the background on it, and this is my first time through it, so it's very much a first time through reaction. But this is a play by Euripides, who was the youngest or the last to be born of the three Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And this is his version of the Orestes story. It somewhat parallels what happens in play 3 of the Orestia by Aeschylus, which is, in Aeschylus' version, it's the kindly ones. But Euripides takes us in a very different direction. Both plays are the aftermath of what happens after Orestes has killed his mother to avenge his father, but two quite different stories. And I guess this is a lesson to me with just how much flexibility these Greek playwrights had in how they interpreted the myth. I think I've said in a number of previous videos that the ending for these stories was already predetermined. The audience already knew what the ending to the story was before the play even started, because these were common folk tales in ancient Greece. But I may have been wrong about that. Or at the very least, there were multiple different versions that the playwrights could choose from. So, in this version, we open up with Electra, who is nursing her brother Orestes because he's being tormented by the Furies for the crime of matricide. That much is the same as in Aeschylus' play. But then, in Aeschylus' play, they move the action to ancient Athens, where an Athenian jury decides between the claims of Orestes and Apollo and the Furies. In this case, they don't go to Athens to solve the problem. Instead, there's an assembly held in Argos itself. Argos is the land of Agamemnon. Menelaus and his wife Helen actually enter the picture, and Orestes pleads with Menelaus for help. And Menelaus, after kind of giving his verbal support to Orestes, essentially says he's not in any position to help Orestes. He can't take on the whole town by himself. He says this is going to require more subtle means, but then he disappears and doesn't really help much at all. Or at least that's how Orestes interprets the situation. Also, Tyndareus, the father of Orestes' mother, and the father of Helen, also shows up to make his case against Orestes. So, anyways, Agamemnon leaves. Then they get a report from Pylades, Orestes' friend, about what happened in the Forum of Argos. We get... it's a messenger, maybe. It's a messenger who brings the report. So there's some back and forth and some politicking among the people of Argos. Some of them want Orestes to die because they've sided with the other faction. So there's a bit of factionalism going on here, which obscures the original justice of the case. Orestes feels that Menelaus has completely betrayed him. So they make a plan to get their revenge on Menelaus before they die. Orestes, Electra, and Pylades, their friend, go in with the intent of killing Helen and taking Helen's daughter Hermione hostage. Helen and Menelaus' daughter. Before they can do it, though, as they're attacking Helen, the god Apollo intervenes and takes Helen up to heaven. So Helen becomes immortalized in that way. Menelaus is a little bit sad because Helen has been parted from him, but Helen is now safe among the gods. Meanwhile, Orestes still has Hermione, Helen and Menelaus' daughter, as a hostage. But Apollo tells Orestes to take his sword away from Hermione's neck. And in fact, he's supposed to marry Hermione, which Orestes agrees to. And that is the end of the play. So that's a brief overview of what's going on there. There are any number of things to pick up from that, and maybe I'll try and pick up a few things. First of all, my background with all this, as I've mentioned in several videos, I've never gotten around to reading these classic Greek plays before. I know I really should have read them long ago, but I never did. I was interested in Greek mythology, though, as a teenager, and I read a number of collections about the Greek myths, which, you read one collection, and then you read another collection, and it's pretty much the same batch of stories, and then you read a third collection, and then pretty soon you start to think, I know this all, I don't need to read anymore. And that's been my position for years, thinking I know all the Greek myths. But the more I dive into this, the more I discover that there's a whole bunch of stories I don't know. And Wikipedia has been a big help in opening my eyes to this as well. So, for example, a couple years ago, when I was rereading the Iliad, I came across a passage when Helen was asking about her daughter. So when Helen went off to Troy with Paris, she had left a daughter behind in Greece, and she was asking about her daughter. And I had completely forgotten Helen had a daughter. But I thought to myself, I wonder what stories there are around Helen's daughter, right? Because Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world. Her daughter must have inherited some of her good looks, right? Are there any stories about her daughter being romanced by other Greek heroes or something like that? So I looked it up on Wikipedia, and sure enough, there's an entry for Helen's daughter, and Helen's daughter's name is Hermione. And so, of course, I was like, so that's where that name comes from. It's a funny thing, actually. If you search Google for Hermione now to try and get information on Helen's daughter, nothing will show up, because like the first 10 pages that show up are all for Hermione Granger, which I guess is the Hermione for our time. But yeah, that's where that name comes from, was Helen's daughter. But then if you look at that, the Wikipedia entry, Helen's daughter had a few adventures, or maybe adventures is the right word, it's the wrong word. She had a few stories about her. So she was initially married to, I'm going to mispronounce his name here, Achilles' son, Neptylus. Where is that? It's name dropped briefly in this play. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. It was who Hermione was originally betrothed to. But then he died, and she ended up marrying Orestes in the end, which is what this play alludes to. Apollo alludes to the fact that Hermione is supposed to marry Neoptolemus, but then says, okay, I'll see to it he dies. So he's setting up how Neapolitus is going to die in the myth, and Orestes is going to eventually end up the husband of Hermione. By the way, this may be as good as time as any to mention. I've seen a couple different interpretations of this play, saying that it's a tragedy, but it's kind of a black comedy or a tragicomedy. And this line might be in line with that. So Apollo just kind of name drops that he's going to make sure Neoptolemus dies so that Orestes can marry Hermione. And I guess perhaps the original audience for this play, already familiar with the myth of how Neapolitus dies and Orestes marries Hermione, would have just maybe chuckled at the way Apollo is just kind of doing these throwaway lines here, alluding to the tragic fate. Sorry, that was a little bit of a digression. I guess the point in all of this being, there's a whole bunch of stories about these characters, which are sometimes not in just the usual retellings of Greek mythology storybooks that you get when you're a kid. And that may be because those Greek mythology traditionally ends with the end of the Trojan War and the heroes coming back home. So the continued adventures of Hermione and Achilles' son Neoptolemus and Orestes usually just kind of get left out. Or maybe they just get left out because, there's so many different side stories about all these characters, you can't tell everything. But I've been intrigued ever since a couple of years ago when I looked up Helen's daughter on Wikipedia to find out more of the stories about her. And here is a story in which she figures prominently. As well, while I'm tracking down stuff, there's another character who gets name dropped in here, which is maybe a minor character in Greek mythology, but I always thought he was kind of interesting. Palamedes. So Palamedes, I first read about him in the Trojan War, which is a retelling of the Trojan War by, I'm blanking on the author's name. I'll leave it in the description in the box down below. But Palamedes is the guy who recruits Odysseus to fight in the Trojan War by unmasking that Odysseus is just faking his madness. Odysseus never forgives Palamedes for that and later frames Palamedes for treason and has him killed at Troy. That's one version of the story. Palamedes is an interesting character. I think he's an interesting character because he doesn't show up at all in Homer's Iliad. So like in the main retelling of the Trojan War that we have, he's just completely absent. But he's and a lot of the other stories about him have been lost. But he apparently was. There's all these myths about him, about how he's a wise man and how he invented the writing system, or how he invented the numbers, or he invented all these different things according to the mythology. And he was betrayed and killed by the Greeks in the Trojan War somehow. There's different versions of it. Some have Odysseus responsible. In this version, it's Agamemnon, Orestes' father, who was responsible. But yeah, I just saw Palamedes, and I thought, oh yeah. Palamedes is another person I've looked up on Wikipedia and tried to trace the various stories connected to him. So, and then here is Oiax, who is, again, just name dropped once. I didn't know who this was. I had to look him up on Wikipedia. But he is, I think, either the brother or cousin of Palamedes, who had come into Argos and gotten involved in the politics there. And so that's another little side story. This doesn't really get developed in the play. But I just find it fascinating the tapestry of Greek mythology and all the intersecting little stories about all these characters here. So that's one thing that's of interest here. The other thing is something that I alluded to earlier, is that this play is kind of almost a farce. There's some tragedy in here, but there's the commentary that I've read or listened to on this is indicating that Euripides is clearly having a little bit of fun with this. And then we have Apollo come out at the end to tell everybody what to do. Now, so enter Apollo with Helen above somewhere. So this apparently was a common device in Greek drama, where the god would appear at the end of the play and he would be above. Now, I mentioned in a previous video I had no idea how they staged this, but again, you can look it up on Wikipedia, and apparently they did have a little machine or a device, like a raised platform where the god would enter in from above. So that's how they would stage this in the ancient world. And the god coming in on this little machine or device and solving all the problems at the end of the play gave rise to the Latin expression Deus ex machina, God from the machine, which you've probably heard before if you've taken a high school English class, literature class. I don't know why we remember it in the Latin, even though it's referring to Greek drama. I guess because Latin has been so influential. But anyways, so if you're at all familiar with the Deus ex machina form of Greek stagecraft, this is where the god shows up at the end. He says, okay, you forgive him, she forgives you, you marry her, everyone goes and it gets settled. And I don't really remember having... I've read a couple plays in this collection in which the god shows up at the end, but not a clear example of this Deus ex machina where the god just shows up and tells everyone what to do and then that's the end of the play. I've not seen a clear example of that until this play here, Orestia, because this is just classic. And again, possibly tongue-in-cheek. But Apollo shows up, he tells everyone where to go, and then he even tells people who to marry. So it says, "In this girl whose throat is being grazed by your sword, Hermione you'll marry. I know she's supposed to marry somebody else, Neoptolemus, I think, but I'll see to it he dies. Give your sister to Pylades as you agreed, his life will be happy." So arranging two marriages right there. And then Orestes immediately agrees. Says, "See, I'm letting Hermione go and will marry her as soon as her father says yes." Now, Anne Carson, in her introduction to this play, points out that this is pretty silly. One minute, he's got his sword against her throat, threatening to kill her. Let's see, where is it? Let me see if I can find the exact line. Oh, yeah, okay, I'm sorry, here it is. So he brings on a god to make things clear, the Deus ex machina being a conventional way of tying off the ends of a Greek tragedy. But here, too, form and content are at odds. So she's talking in her introduction about how Euripides was using the form of the Greek tragedy, but he was subverting it with his content. For the god in question, it is Apollo, dictates a series of solutions that make nonsense of all the action and anguish of the characters up to that point. For example, he instructs Orestes, who happens to be holding his sword to the throat of a young girl named Hermione, to lower his weapon and marry her. Orestes merrily agrees to do so. How should we read moments like this, where exasperation verges on farce? And she advances the theory that Orestes is setting up some sort of tragic comedy here, or another theory. There's another way to read Euripides, which is to forget seriousness and just see him as having a good time in the theater, creating sensation and spectacle, throwing the pieces up in the air and letting them fall. I guess what to make of this play apparently has been the subject of some discussion. It's a pretty wild play. One of the things that all the commentary on this agrees that I've read is that this is in the wake of the Peloponnesian War and the disillusionment with Greek culture that resulted from the Peloponnesian War, and the corruption of politics, etc. Again, this is something Anne Carson mentions in her introduction. Referring to Euripides, was a time of constant warfare, imperialist greed, and astonishing political corruption, rather like our own. Perhaps the sign of the disillusionment brought about by the Peloponnesian War is that in the equivalent play in Aeschylus, the Kindly Ones, Orestes is freed by a jury trial in Athens in which the evidence is presented and the jury makes a fair decision. In Orestes by Euripides, on the other hand, the different factions are already prejudiced against Orestes before the trial even begins. They make some speeches which fall down on party lines, and then Orestes ends up being convicted because he happens to have a lot of enemies in town who either blame him for things or want to seize power. And so I guess maybe that could be read as the response to the play in Aeschylus, or the sign of how the faith in the institutions and the concept of justice is breaking down. Another thing, when this play was staged, it was before the Peloponnesian War was even over. So there was some anguish about the ongoing horrors of the war, which perhaps is why Apollo would say at the very end, "Go then, honoring peace, most beautiful of gods." It's an interesting play. This translation by Anne Carson was very readable. It read just like plain English. I found it very easy to read, very pleasant to read. A lot of interesting stuff going on in here. And maybe I'll just finish there. Again, I'm not claiming to have any great insight into this play, but those are my thoughts after the first time reading it.